For these very timely events, I'm very honored to be able to moderate this panel. I'm Jonathan Rui, Director of Foreign Policy at GINSA, and today's discussion will feature General Philip Breedlove and John Hanna. General Breedlove is former NATO Supreme Allied Commander, former commander of US European Command, and in 2018, a participant in GINSA's Generals and Admirals program. John Hanna is former Vice President Dick Cheney's National Security Advisor and is currently a senior fellow at GINSA's Gemunder Center for Defense and Strategy. During the webinar, you may submit questions through the Q&A box on your screen, and I will submit them to the panelists in the last fraction of our event today. For those in the audience, you are automatically muted and your video is off. GINSA is very lucky to have with us today this wealth of knowledge on our panel. And given our tight time frame, I'm going to skip any intro remarks and ask General Breedlove to pick up where he left off a little less than 2 weeks ago on a previous GINSA Zoom to bring us up to speed on the momentous events that have happened in the last week plus in Ukraine on the ground and on the battlefield. General Breedlove, look forward to hearing your thoughts. Thank you.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me back. And I look forward primarily to the questions and answers today. So we'll try to be relatively brief and save time for those. Just to catch us up from where we were last time, the last 3 or 4 days before the invasion were characterized primarily by incredible troop buildups. In the last days, what got moved forward was not so much the fighting troops, but all of the enabling troops, all of the logistics troops, medical troops, logistics trains, ammunitions, etc., that were still pouring into the area, with one exception, and that is even in the last several days, several major combatants arrived into the Black Sea area to give capability to the south. And so then we went into a period of some fairly tense exchanges between governments, etc. And there was no resolution to Mr. Putin's demands. And so, of course, about 5 days ago, the war started. I will not refrain from using invasion and war because I believe that's what it is. You know, there was some bantering about that early, but it's pretty clear now exactly what we're facing. Russia has in a major way invaded Ukraine for a 3rd time now in our history. And so what I'll do is I'll start at the top and just do a clockwise spin around the eastern part of Ukraine. One of the features that we talked about last time was that Russia had built a force that could run due west through Belarus and then come straight south on Kyiv, the capital. And in those last few days and week, an exercise started in Belarus, whereby there were purportedly 30,000 or so troops up there. And they were joined by other troops coming from the east to the west. And that group now has gone straight south towards Kyiv. Alarmingly through Chernobyl, and there's been damage to what we had set up, which was a safe setup in Chernobyl, and now we're going to face challenges there. I don't want to spend too much on the details. The fact of the matter is that was the stroke that everybody thought would be less than 2 days and this would be over. And here we are 5.5 days later. The Russians have lost a lot of troops, a lot of tanks, armored personnel carrier, fixed wing aircraft, and helicopters in that fight. And most notably, 2 transport loads full of para soldiers that were going to take the airfield north of Kyiv were both shot down and lost. So the Russians have taken a bloody nose in the north, but to close the northern area, right now you see on the TV this massive formation that's trying to head south. It is having problems, and we could talk about that in the Q&A. Further around the clock to the about 1 o'clock position in, or 2 o'clock, 1 to 2 o'clock position in Ukraine, of course, is Kharkiv. And this is a major industrial city, and some very highly technical industries in there, and some pretty tough industries like main battle tanks and things in that city. It's a big, important city. Some call it the second biggest city in the country, etc. And Kharkiv took a thrust that really we didn't anticipate. We thought that the main push would be west and then straight down into Kyiv. And we thought that the attack on Kharkiv would actually maybe come from the Donbass pocket to the north. And surely there were some forces that came from the Donbass pocket and turned north towards Kharkiv, but a large thrust from across the border from Russia and Belarus towards Kharkiv. Kharkiv battled mightily in the first couple of days. And again, the Russians took a bloody nose and lost. They ventured into the city too quickly and learned that urban warfare with armored personnel carriers and tanks is a tough business, and they took a bloody nose. And the people of Kharkiv have been holding out. I sadly will say that they are pretty close to being encircled. And frankly, Russia has changed tactics. They were doing fairly surgical strikes. They are now into punishing strikes. They are indiscriminately striking in big ways, population, schools, notably this morning, a kindergarten and other things. So I think Mr. Putin is a little bit exacerbated over the lack of progress, and they've changed tactics. What I am concerned about there is if it gets so brutal like it did in Chechnya and like it did in Syria with the barrel bombs and the terrorist sort of bombings, this could be a game changer in the grand scheme of things. Further around towards the Donbass. The Donbass pocket really hasn't grown much, but if you remember, I mentioned the last time we talked that could be, that what that pocket could be is just to fix the forces that were there. If you remember, some of the best Russian forces were arrayed around the line of contact on the western edge of the Donbass pocket. And we talked about the fact that there may be enough fighting there that it would keep the forces that Ukraine has from being able to respond to the north or the south where they might be more needed. So there is fighting in the Donbass pocket. It is being enlarged, but it doesn't seem to be the bigger pushes that we see in other places. As we now come around down to about the 4 o'clock position on the eastern edge of Ukraine, we see that push that we've talked about a lot, about going along the coast towards Crimea. And most importantly, the very first thing to fall there, or not fall, but be encircled, is the port of Mariupol. And if you know this port, it's incredibly important to Ukraine because in years past, it was where almost all of the grain out of the breadbasket of Europe flowed out of Ukraine. And some, I don't know these numbers to be true, but some said was about a fifth of the economy, GDP. And so that port is no longer usable to Ukraine at this point. And then the last 2 points on the extreme southern part of Ukraine, of course, is Crimea, the Ukrainian peninsula of Crimea that is occupied by Russian forces. Don't buy into the Russian narrative that that's Russian. It's a Ukrainian peninsula occupied by Russian forces. Of course, the forces there were reinforced and they have moved north out of Crimea. They have busted open the dam that was holding the water there. They're trying to reestablish access to water, among other things. They're turning both east and west along the coastline as they come out of Crimea, and that pocket is expanding. And then the last point to talk about, or maybe 2 points, are 2 smaller areas of concern. One is the port of Odessa. The town or city of Odessa is actually a pretty big place, and it has not been taken. but the Russian naval infantry has landed and taken the port facility. So now Mariupol is gone, Sevastopol is gone, and ostensibly, yet to be determined if they can hold it, but ostensibly Odessa is gone. And now Ukraine is cut off from the sea, and all of their commerce will have to go a different direction. And that is going to be a massive strain on the Ukrainian economy. The last point to make out is I think Mr. Putin is fed up with all of the resupply and flow in and out of the Polish border. So now we see a force that's in the extreme west of Belarus that appears to be now trying to go south to cut that border and to stop that flow of resupply and stop the people from leaving and stop some from coming back in. But that is very much in its beginning or nascent stages. We don't really know how much of an emphasis that push is going to be, but it is certainly there. Final remark, the Ukrainian air defenses are still putting up a fight, but they have been severely diminished, both their ground sites and their Air Force sites. And so you see some nations trying to do some things. So I think, Jonathan, I'll stop there, and we'll see what people want to talk about when we get to Q&A.
Great, thank you very much, General. And just to kick off the Q&A portion here, I'd like to sort of follow up on your opening remarks and sort of pose what I hope is not a leading question, but I imagine that if you're sitting in the Kremlin right now, this, at least so far, and obviously everything can change, but at least so far, this doesn't feel like a very successful military operation for Russia. To what extent do you agree with that assessment? And if so, what do you see as the main factors of Russia's failure, at least thus far?
So I agree with that assessment. But Jonathan, I was unfortunately exposed to some classified data, so I can't talk about it, but I've kept myself away from the classified data so that I could speak freely here. And I think the primary thing that we can say is that this invasion has not met our expectations, and it certainly hasn't met Mr. Putin's expectations at this point. The Ukrainians are fighting harder than expected. They're having a lot more success than expected. And I think that we're to blame for this. Well, certainly Russia has got some problems, but we're also to blame for this. We were in the Western press, and President Zelensky, by the way, pointed that out to our group when we were there visiting a little over a week ago. You know, the Western press has been myopically focused on the forces and the buildup of the forces and the massive size of the forces and how ugly this looked for Ukraine. And what we weren't paying attention to is it's pretty obvious to me that Ukraine has done a wonderful job of building a defense in depth. And they have been attacking and harassing and causing problems for these forces from the moment they come across the border. And they have, I believe, done a great job of getting ready for this. And we were not paying attention because we were so focused on what Russia was doing. Now, that sounds very optimistic. Here's what I'm optimistic about. The Ukrainian military forces and the Ukrainian people have proven they're going to fight. They are going to fight. They are fighting, and they're having some success. But there's a lot of force still coming at them. And just looking at some saying a 40-mile convoy north of Russia. And because Russia can thwart the Ukrainian air forces, that convoy has not come under serious attack from the air. It has been taking harassing attacks from the ground, but not from the air. I hope that answers.
Yes, thank you. And I would like to, before we jump ahead and get a little more perspective in our outlook, I'd like to pivot to you, John, sort of in parallel to what General Breedlove has described playing out on the battlefield of Ukraine. We've seen something perhaps almost as unexpected, at least from the perspective of a week ago, in terms of what we've seen on the more diplomatic and economic front. are you surprised by the unity and resolve you've seen from, broadly speaking, the West in response to Putin's aggression? And then as a follow-on, what do you think Putin's reaction is? Is he as surprised on that front as he may be on the military front?
Well, thank you, Jonathan, and thanks to General Breedlove for being with us today and providing that fascinating tour d'horizon of the current situation. Listen, I don't think I was as pessimistic as a lot of people were about the ability of the West to be galvanized around a full-scale Russian invasion of a completely innocent and sovereign country right on the borders of Europe, as some people were quite pessimistic. There are things that the Biden administration deserves significant credit for, in my opinion, and one of them is clearly the work they did diplomatically over the course of the past several months. I mean, literally hundreds of meetings of senior American officials, not only with their European counterparts, but with counterparts in Australia and Asia and Canada. But even so, even being as pleasantly surprised as the relatively swift movement, and I stress relatively because this is NATO, it's a 30-member alliance. You add in the EU to that and a number of other countries, the degree to which they've been able to coordinate these announcements of sanctions and the effort to really isolate Russia and to isolate Putin personally and to go after him and his inner circle of cronies and oligarchs, with oftentimes the Europeans themselves, who are far more vulnerable to Russian economic coercion than the United States is, with the Europeans actually leading on many of these announcements and the United States coming in afterwards. I think that's all very clearly choreographed to impress upon Putin and Putin's friends around the world, including the Chinese, just how serious Europe and the rest of the world beyond the United States takes what has happened here as a major, major threat to international stability and security and peace and security in Europe in particular. I think Putin all along has been under the impression, not completely without reason, that he was on the cusp, particularly in the wake of something like Afghanistan and the disaster and debacle of the American withdrawal from Afghanistan, that he was on the cusp of achieving not only his ability to subjugate Ukraine and have a puppet regime in Ukraine, but to actually fracture the West, fracture NATO, fracture the EU, the main pillars of the post-Cold War international order led by the United States and Europe. And that if he only was able to instigate this kind of crisis, to confront them with this overwhelming Russian threat, that they would break apart, that you'd have Germany going one way, France going another, the United States doing something else, and people like the Japanese maybe sitting it out completely. He has been proven completely wrong on that, just as he has been proven completely wrong on what the response of the Ukrainians would be once Russian tanks cross that border. It really, and I'd love to hear General Breedlove talk about who's to blame here for this horrendous battle plan and political military plan that the Russians put in place here. Before this, I had heard generally positive remarks about people like General Gerasimov, the man in charge of Russian forces. So it does make you wonder, is this Stalin or Hitler with their generals and overriding their best advice to implement a military plan that has now completely failed, at least in this initial week, and embarrassed and humiliated the Russians? You wonder what kind of advice, how isolated, how detached was Putin? Who was telling him that once our guys cross the border, Mr. President, we've got a coup completely wired. Zelensky will flee. Kyiv will fall to our forces. A lot of Ukrainians actually agree with you that they consider themselves more Russian than Ukrainian, and they'll welcome Russian tanks and Russian forces as liberators. This has been one of the great miscalculations in military history of underestimating the enemy you were facing. So, but again, I would just underscore what General Breedlove said. We're only a week into this. The Russians have left unbelievable firepower and destructive power on the table, yet to be used. We're only beginning to see some of this brutality, Chechnya and Syria style, being used in Kharkiv. We saw they finally attacked a radio and TV tower in outside of Kyiv today. So, nobody should get too triumphalist. As heroic as the Ukrainians have been, I think we could have I've said all along, the Ukrainians are facing a very long, dark night of not just days, but weeks and months potentially. And I think the better course for the United States, as much as we hope the Ukrainians can actually defeat the Russians and send them back across that border with their tail between their legs in the coming days and weeks, I think probably the better part of caution is that we need to be preparing a more medium and long-term strategy to make sure that the Ukrainian nation will be able to continue to sustain this fight, that Putin, even if he wins and holds this territory, will never be able to actually defend it against 25, 30, 35 million Ukrainians who are more determined than ever, particularly after whatever destruction Putin is going to now rain down on them, to never give in to whatever regime and quisling that Putin is able eventually to establish in Kyiv.
Could I add a quick note to John's
Please.
list, which was really superb? And John, let me know if you don't agree. The Russian disinformation machine has, in the past 10, 20 years, just really, it's just really gotten quite good. I mean, we just have to be intellectually honest. They've developed this weapon to a great degree. But it is my observation, just my personal observation, that the story behind why we're here right now for Mr. Putin and his senior folks is much thinner and not so solid this time. I mean, this whole idea that we're in Ukraine because it's a bunch of neo-Nazis and drug dealers that have taken over Ukraine, it's just not as smooth as it has been in the past. Now, a learned colleague told me, Phil, it's more of an internal message than an external message. He's given up on the external message. But I just must say that Russia, I'll just put it out there, Russia's lies are usually a little smoother and a little bit harder to dispute. And this time it's been fairly straightforward. This is Mr. Putin, and it's all about Mr. Putin. And I would just add that to your list of things that haven't gone well. And if in the Q&A people want to talk about some of the observations about why it's not going well, Jonathan, I'll be happy to talk to that.
Jonathan, if I can I agree entirely with General Breedlove. It's shocking how bad the Russian disinformation campaign has gone here. I do. Again, this is another area where I give some credit to the Biden administration for their willingness to deploy American intelligence and American information campaigns to get inside that Russian disinformation loop, and I think expose it in very, very effective ways, maybe at some cost to our own intelligence and sources and methods. But I think at almost every turn, in trying to begin to develop these Russian narratives of false flag operations and Nazis and attacks and genocide, that the Biden administration, to its great credit, I think has been kind of at least one step ahead of the Russians. And I I think it probably caused Putin enormous frustration. And he finally decided none of this is working. I'm going regardless of what it looks like to the rest of the world. And I'll try it as best as I can to defend it internally in Russia, to the people out in the provinces and boondocks who get all of their news and information from Russian government TV and radio sources.
One more just short pylon to echo what John said. After this is all over, there's going to be the normal finger pointing and debriefing and all that stuff. But I think one thing we're all going to agree on, and I'll go out on a limb and say, I believe this is the first time that I've really seen the White House fight an information campaign, because I think they had a pretty good approach. They had a steady drumbeat and rhythm, and they were getting things out there that were clearly confusing those out there. I think that it was almost funny, but I was laughing at the Russians, not us, when President Biden announced when the invasion was going to start. And I think that delayed the invasion because they didn't want to give him that victory. And on that day, of course, there were several senior Russians saying, we'd like to get the White House to send us a schedule so we can know when to take our holidays. You know, they were trying to laugh at what the White House was doing, but I think it was an admission of, damn it, they're inside of our loop here. Excuse my expletive there.
So General Breedlove, given these this sort of panoply of shortcomings and lack of sophistication, shall we say, across the spectrum of warfare from the Russians, and obviously trying to predict anything in war is perhaps a fool's errand. But do you have a sense whether, at this point, we mentioned we're only 5 to 6 days into this. Do you see the Russians sort of strategically and operationally sort of doubling down and trying to sort of keep pushing on their pre-invasion objectives, or are they gonna? Do you think they're adaptable? Will they try to shift attack here?
Well, part of adaptability is deciding to double down as well. I mean, I don't exclude one from the other. I do believe they've already made a series of decisions that we've got to do something different. Because if you saw in the beginning, I think there was a relatively good attempt at trying to not inflame Europe by having civilians blown up everywhere. But that has changed. If you see what's going on in Kyiv, this is indiscriminate. And as I said in my sort of walk around the battlefield, if we start to see in Kharkiv and in Kyiv and other places, the kind of approach to bombing for terror and bombing to get civilians on the road as refugees like they did in Syria and Chechnya and other places. If we see that, I think that will be a miscalculation, but I believe we're seeing the leading edge of that now in Kharkiv.
So I'll ask this question first to John, but General Breedlove, please chime in if you feel like doing so. John, sort of, Putin sort of seems like he's crossed a Rubicon here with this conflict, and we know there were potentially talks along the border between Russia and Ukraine, I believe yesterday. But I mean, are there off ramps for Putin? Are there things we could provide to give him one? Do you think he would take it, or is this sort of the political analog of the question I just asked General Breedlove? Is doubling down the next step for Putin here?
Yeah, it's a very worrisome situation, Jonathan, from any kind of diplomatic standpoint. Once Putin gave the order to go in full force with the obvious objective, as revealed in that long diatribe that he gave several days before the invasion, that Ukraine was an illegitimate state, that the only acceptable endpoint here now was the complete denazification, demilitarization of Ukraine, and it's at a minimum removing the Zelensky government and installing a puppet Quisling regime to Moscow, and at most actually reabsorbing Ukraine or breaking it up and bringing it back into the Putin's vision of some kind of Russian imperial empire. I think once he committed to that objective, it's very hard to think of how he climbs down from this ladder. What does de-escalation look like? Because I think that's the only way that the West and the Ukrainians can proceed here. I mean, it's of course up to Zelensky. He's got enormous credibility now with his own people. He's the George Washington of his country, of modern Ukraine. And if he says there are things we can provide to the Russians that don't infringe on our sovereignty and territorial integrity, okay. But he's never going to give up on Crimea. He's never going to give up on the Donbass. He's certainly not going to cede any of the territories that the Russians may be in control of now. I think the only acceptable outcome, certainly for the United States and our allies, is A, to support Zelensky and the Ukrainian people entirely in their demands, and to see those Russian forces eventually move out and return to Russia and de-escalate, have a ceasefire, and we can have some kind of discussion. But if you're Vladimir Putin, and you have committed to this grandiose objective to get the band back together, the Russian imperial empire, the old Soviet Union at a minimum, you've lost 4,000 young boys who had no idea, a lot of them, what in the heck they are doing inside of Ukraine, battling fellow Slavs who have done nothing against Russia. Except now trying to defend their homeland and their children. Putin will have a very, very difficult case to make in any kind of anything acceptable diplomatically to the Ukrainians first and foremost, but then to the United States and the West. Anything acceptable to us, I think, for Putin. Really, and I think people have to think, people who know more about Russia, about the Russian military, about the Russian people, what kind of backlash that'll have inside of Russia and what it will mean for Putin's own future. Russia does have some history in the last century of regime change, maybe all the way back to the late 1900s. But certainly the Russo-Japanese War, World War I, the debacle for the Soviets in Afghanistan, all of these things are these lost wars are inflection points for actual regime change in Russia. And I think that's got to be weighing very, very heavily on Putin's mind, that there's not, really any acceptable, potentially diplomatic off-ramp for him at this point, which again is a very, very dangerous situation, particularly if, as people are saying, like the ranking member of the Senate Intelligence Committee, Senator Rubio, who's a member of the Gang of Eight in the American Congress and receiving the most highly classified intelligence briefings on a daily basis. He's telling us, don't make the mistake of believing this is the Vladimir Putin of 5 or 10 years ago. This is a much different man, and potentially a much more dangerous man, was certainly the implication. And I do think we need to keep a very careful eye on that. But I don't see we have a huge amount of flexibility and room for maneuver on the diplomacy unless President Zelensky and the Ukrainian parliament, Ukrainian people lead that.
Thank you. There's a couple issues there I want to hopefully come back to before we close, but I'd be remiss if I didn't ask General Breedlove in the time we have, how you assess the impact of Western supplied arms to Ukraine, if they've assisted in Ukraine's ability to resist thus far, and what, if anything, you think the United States or our NATO allies could be realistically send the Ukrainian military to help their defense?
Can I open it to bigger than air defense? Because actually, I think one of the things we've missed is the ability to help Ukraine control its coastal waters. We knew the Ukrainian Navy was not going to be able to stand up to the Russian Navy. The Russians brought in a lot of force, all the way from the North Sea, the Baltic Seas, the Caspian Seas. They brought in a lot of force. And I truly believe if the West had been more forthcoming with coastal defense cruise missiles early in this business, it could have changed the picture on the water quite a bit. And so it's more than air defense. Our allies have sent Stingers, but for reasons that the government will explain later, the United States hadn't sent any of the new Stingers. I think that starts happening today. We'll get some new Stingers in there. The Javelin has clearly had an impact on the battlefield, clearly had an impact. And again, as a mistake was made in a couple of places already in this war, if you take a large armored vehicle into an urban area, it really restricts its ability to defend itself. And if you hide and then hit it, especially in the sides or the flanks as opposed to in the face, these things can be defeated. And I think that they've figured this out now. And so, yes, the resupply has helped. No, we're not done. We need to do more. We need to help them. And there's a few technologies, drone technologies and others, that have had quite an impact that are very limited because there's not that many of them. But frankly, I don't like to use the word drones, but that's what everybody understands. The remotely piloted vehicles that are in the fight have had impact. So, and may I just add one more thing I forgot to mention before. One of the things that I would add also to John's wonderful list of things that haven't gone so well or have surprised me is the lack of what I would call a combined arms warfare piece from Russia. We don't see that combination of artillery, air force, helicopters, and then ground forces moving in a choreographed way. Think about how the United States advanced through the deserts north of Kuwait and how closely choreographed all of the different kinds of fires were laid in order to advance a force. And we really haven't seen that out of Russia yet. And so that's something for us to study afterwards, why that didn't happen.
Hey, Jonathan, just quickly, I'll add to the list further. At least surprising for me is the fact that Zelensky and others have been up on the internet, on Facebook, on various social media platforms, broadcasting to their people, galvanizing the Ukrainian people in unbelievable ways every day, hour by hour. And why the Russian vaunted cyber capabilities have not been part of that combined arms package to really take the Ukrainian leadership off of the airways, even if they left alone Ukrainian critical infrastructure and allowed the lights and water and things to be kept on for the moment. Why they haven't been successful on the cyber front more with the Ukrainians is a bit of a mystery again to me.
So I would just pile on that one again in that I don't want to start, a discussion about who's who in the zoo, but I saw a tweet just a few minutes ago that was just wonderful. John, it's not only him speaking to the Ukrainian people, he's speaking to the world. And the tweet, whether we agree with it or not, says the West finally finds a leader. Think that's going to sting in a few places, but there you have it.
So I want to try to cover a little bit more ground in the remaining 10 minutes we have, and this will tie in some audience Q&A. I'll pose this first to you, General Breedlove, but then open it up. Suppose Ukraine is defeated, presumably Russia achieved its objectives, and on the military level and the political level. What does Putin do next, and what does the West do next? But let's give given your former hat as SACEUR, what does NATO do next?
So let me make sure I understood the question. Ukraine overcomes the problem and Russia's attempt to do this is defeated. Is that what you're?
Sorry, the other way around.
Okay.
Russia achieves something approaching victory.
Okay, that makes more sense to me. I thought you were asking me a question that is going to be a little hard to deal with. So this is an incredible dilemma. If Mr. Putin achieves his objectives, it is hard for me, Phil Breedlove, to believe that he can do that over the entire country. As John mentioned before, this is a huge country with a huge population, and 200,000 troops are not going to be enough to subjugate the whole country. And so the nightmare concern for me would be that he just carves off a much bigger part of Ukraine, east of the Dnieper or something like that, whatever it is. And then we are left with the old East Germany, West Germany, East Berlin, West Berlin dilemma. And how does the world handle that? Of course, what you hear so much spoke about now is this whole idea of a resistance movement. Some people use the term guerrilla warfare, which I think is not really accurate. It would be part of a resistance movement, but a resistance movement is much bigger than that. And so I do believe that the Ukrainians would put up a stiff long-term battle, but we don't have to look much farther than Chechnya and other places to see how the Russians deal with that in the long term. I think it would be an ugly, ugly thing. It may play out over time, but it would just be an ugly thing. And I think the world would turn slowly even worse against Mr. Putin if we end up in that sort of potato mashing mode. But the more geostrategic questions is, what does the EU do? What does NATO do? What does the rest of the world that are not aligned to EU or NATO do? And I would like to think that what we see playing out now geopolitically is what he would see for the long term. I mean, brandishing Russia appropriately for these actions is going to stick in a lot of places. In a few places it'll fade, but I think it's going to stick. And I think that it will be a problem for him in the long term. I'll allow John to grade my paper and get better answers.
No, that
John,
was,
is there anything like that?
well, I mean, I would just add that, what we didn't have in Grozny and what Putin escaped with in Crimea, we've got some serious sanctions put in place now, joined in by all the major economies in the world now, except China's for the moment. But I wonder whether China, at the end of the day, looking at the tiny, small Russian economy compared to the size of the markets in America and Europe and Canada and Australia, is really going to become Putin's banker and his provider of technology necessary to run his industrial economy. So I think Putin is facing real stresses that are only going to get worse, particularly if the United States and Europe get serious about a medium to long-term energy policy, which I hope and pray, but don't expect the president will announce tonight in his State of the Union speech, in addition to taking a page out of Jimmy Carter's playbook after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, where Carter, within weeks of that Soviet invasion, went to the Congress and said, I'm going to ask for a greater than 10% increase in the American defense budget. And he announced the Carter Doctrine to protect the Persian Gulf against any outside aggressor or attempts to dominate the oil flows in the Gulf. I would like to see the Joe Biden equivalent of that, coming to the American people, telling them we are going to stand and support Ukraine. We are going to only ratchet up these sanctions further. We're going to make sure that if the Ukrainian people are prepared to continue fighting for their freedom, we are going to do what we did in Afghanistan in the 1980s and ensure that Ukraine becomes Putin's Afghanistan by providing assistance and weapons and explosives to Ukrainian partisans. I'd like to see him do something major on the defense budget. I'd like to see him do something major on energy. And to tell the American people, we may be in for a long fight here, that you know, the post-Cold War era is over. The central assumption of that, the last 30 years, is that Europe and the United States don't really have to worry about a conventional Russian military attack or threat in Europe. I think even as badly as the Russian military has done in this invasion of Ukraine, I think that pillar of the post-Cold War era has collapsed, and America and Europe need to wake up from their holiday from history and realize now that it's not only China that they've got to worry about for the next few decade or more, but it's Russia as well. I personally would love it if the president announced we're going to return to providing our military what it needs to fight and win two major conventional wars simultaneously. Again, I doubt this president will do that, but hope springs eternal. But I think this is an inflection point in history, what Putin has done here. And I think the president really does need to continue to rise to this challenge.
And thank you very much, John. I think with that admonition, I believe we're up against it with General Breedlove's heart out. I know he's in incredibly high demand, higher than usual right now. So I'd like to join Jinsa in thanking you, General Breedlove, for your time today. And thank you, John, for your remarks as well. And all those watching, please tune in for future Jinsa events. Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Thank you, General.